Hi everyone, the topic of this video is William Cowper, 1731 to 1800. And the quote that I have there comes from his poem, Hatred and Vengeance. It says, "I, fed with judgments, in a fleshly tomb am buried above ground." And that, that chilling line, I think captures pretty well the mood of some of Cowper's most memorable poetry, which reflects his struggles with mental health that lasted throughout his adult life. We'll talk about that as we get into the timeline here. It's a famous portrait by George Romney, famous painter at the time. The portrait was engraved by William Blake for William Haley's biography of Cowper. He was born in 1731 in Berkhamsted to John Cowper, who was a clergyman, and Mother Anne, who died when Cowper was just 5 years old. She died giving birth to his brother John. And then his aunt and uncle on his mother's side encouraged his love of literature as a child. In 1742, he's at Westminster School studying the classics and masters classical languages there in preparation for a career in law. And during this time, he publishes some of his first poems, moral satires, more in the Augustan vein of poems, like those of Pope, for example. In 1763, he experiences the first crisis of his life after the death of his mother, of course. After a failed courtship with his cousin Theodora and the coinciding stress of his legal studies, he suffers an intense bout of depression that leads to several suicide attempts, and eventually he's committed to an asylum in St. Albans for a time. And during his recovery, he's a big part of that recovery was a revival of spirituality, and he settles with a retired clergyman named Morley Unwin and his wife Mary in the town of Huntingdon, and they took care of him, nursed him back to health, and gave him spiritual counsel. And after Morley's death, he died in a horse riding accident. He and the widow Mary moved to the town of Olney, where he befriended a curate there named John Newton, who was a former slave trader who converted to Christianity and became an ardent abolitionist against the slave trade, and later influenced Cowper's own abolitionist views and poetry. And there on the right is a portrait of Mary Unwin. That's a stained glass window. I think that's at St. Nicholas's Cathedral in Norfolk, where Cowper is buried. A beautiful window shows him. You can see that he's engaged in deep intellectual discourse with his animals, his dogs and rabbits. Very famous for keeping pet rabbits. Part of his therapy, I'm sure. In 1773, he experienced a severe relapse of insanity and suicidal thoughts. Mary nursed him back to health, but he believed himself damned and abandoned by God, and he stopped attending church services and turns for comfort to gardening and raising pets. In 1779, he collaborates with John Newton on a hymn book, a very famous hymn book called the Oni Hymns, and the most famous of the hymns published in It's Amazing Grace, although that one's not Cowper's, but many of Cowper's hymns are sung in churches today, although I imagine most people don't realize that Cowper wrote them. Mary, at this time, is encouraging him to write poetry as a means of coping with his mental illness, and his first collection of poems appeared in 1782, published by Joseph Johnson, who would also publish The Task in 1785 in 6 books. And this is the poem for which Cowper is best known today. So in the late 1780s, a society for effecting the abolition of the slave trade formed, a very powerful political group that influenced this debate and brought the matter to Parliament, although they would not be successful at abolishing the slave trade until 1807. But in the late 1780s, they invited Cowper to submit poems in support of the cause, and one of the poems he offered was The Negro's Complaint, which was published in 1788, and you see it there with its famous image with the phylactery scrolled out there, "Am I not a man and a brother?" In 1791, he published his translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey in blank verse. Remember, they had been translated by Pope from around 1715 to the 1720s. And that was in heroic couplets, and that was the translation that dominated the 18th century and continued to be read into the 19th century. But Cowper published his in blank verse. In 1796, Mary Unwin, who I think was, I'm not sure how much older than Cowper she was. I think she was maybe 8 or 10 years older than he was, and she died in 1796. And this precipitated another severe bout of depression from which Cowper would never recover. And he died in 1800 and was buried near Mary Unwin in Norfolk. Look, it's old tiny. Actually, that's Albrecht Dürer's drawing of a rabbit. But The Task is what we're going to talk about here, published in 1785, as I said, and I chose a passage from The Task there, which I think sums up much of what he talks about in the first book, which we're reading. God made the country and man made the town. What wonder then that health and virtue, gifts that can alone make sweet the bitter draught that life holds out to all, should most abound and least be threatened in the fields and groves. So, like James Thomson and the Wharton brothers before him, before Cowper, Cowper composed his most ambitious poems in blank verse, or unrhymed iambic pentameter. As he wrote to his publisher, Joseph Johnson, in 1791, quote, "Give me a manly, rough line with a deal of meaning in it, rather than a whole poem full of musical periods that have nothing but their oily smoothness to recommend them." That year, Johnson published Cowper's translations of Homer, the first complete translation since Pope's version in heroic couplets some 70-odd years earlier. And those translations, of course, were in blank verse. Cowper's long ruminative poem, The Task, which was published in 1785, if not his most remembered work today, is certainly his most ambitious, and it too was composed in blank verse. And the pre-romantic qualities we observe in the poems of Thomson, Goldsmith, the Whartons, and Gray, one finds here as well. His antipathy toward the luxury and artifice of city life, his keen responsiveness to the natural world, and his attentiveness to the workings of memory and imagination. These are all themes that he takes up in this poem. It has a strange structure, The Task. It wanders from topic to topic, but not in a way that's awkward or disorienting. And I think the structure of the poem kind of reflects the train of thoughts that he would have on these therapeutic walks that he would have with Mary Unwin across the countryside. In fact, he addresses her directly in Book 1 of The Task, The Sofa, describing their countryside rambles. But there were 5 more books, although we're not reading them in here. Book 2, The Timepiece, contains some more abolitionist verses, and he examines what he perceived as the moral and spiritual decadence of England at the time. Book 3, The Garden, extols the virtues of simple country life, and he talks a lot about gardening, something that he did that was part of his therapy at the time. And Book 4, The Winter Evening, it describes the comforts of home life, quiet domesticity, but also a good deal of time in there addressing the problems of rural poverty and its impact. Book 5, The Winter Morning Walk. This is the most political of the books in the task. He talks about war, tyranny, and celebrates liberty. And you got to remember that the task, appearing in 1785, it appears right between two major revolutions, the American Revolution and then the French Revolution, which would be the Bastille would fall 4 years after publication of the task. And then finally, the last book, Book 6, The Winter Walk at Noon, talks about his love of animals, and it includes an ecstatic vision of heaven, and that's how he wraps up the task. So some questions to guide our discussion in class as we make our way through Book 1 is, where in Book 1 does Cowper contrast city and country life? And what advantages does the poor rustic have over the wealthy city dweller? And what does Cowper value about the natural world? And what effects do plant and animal life have on him? And finally, there are these interesting figures that appear in the sofa. He talks about a distressed country girl named Kate, what happens to her, and also talks about this, he calls him the gentle savage, Oh My of Raiatea. And what do you think is Cowper's interest in these figures? And you might also think about how they connect with some of the other characters, the other characters and subjects of poems outside of the task. So we are reading several other poems, several other lyrics, like The Poplar Field and Yardley Oak, for example. How do these poems develop the pre-romantic themes and ideas observed in earlier poets like Thomson, Gray, and the Wartons? And then finally, what parallels do you see between natural phenomena like the trees in the poplar field in Yardley Oak, or the icebergs and on the ice islands, and figures like the slave in The Negro's Complaint and the castaway? And also one could throw in there Oh My of Raiatea and Crazy Kate as well. You know, what are the common relationships between all these different objects and people? And that concludes this video introduction to William Cowper. That's an iceberg by Frederick Church there. And On the Ice Islands is one of the most fantastic poems in English, in my opinion.